I've got a fake gun behind my desk, but it's fake. It's plastic. It's just, I just didn't want you to worry about it the whole time. For the most part, I find horror movies dumb because the things that they think are going to scare me aren't scary at all. A doll with a knife? I don't sit around and worry the dolls will come to life and murder me. Big giant monster things with drool that comes out of their mouth and their tongue like goes up against you, like this kind of stuff. Yeah, it's interesting on camera, but it's not scary because it's so far-fetched. When I was a kid, that stuff would stick in my brain a little bit, but as I got older, there's one horror theme that really worked on me more and more and continues to work on me, and that is zombies. Zombies are so interesting to me and also so scary to me. I love zombie movies because I can picture that kind of evil. I can picture what it looks like in history, even in relationships, maybe even a little bit within myself, for a human to become so detached and so broken that they look like me and you, but everything is dead inside and they are willing to do crazy, awful, horrible, violent things to other people. And in Acts chapter 21, we are going to see something that has been building to a head all throughout Paul's ministry in Acts, finally get to a place of explosive, mass, zombie-like insanity. So, get out your pitchfork, your gun, your bat, your nails, and your bear spray. We're going to be in Acts chapter 21 verses something through something else. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Here we go. In part one of this passage, Luke opens with some housekeeping, just an Indiana Jones red lines and map description of how we got from where Paul and his companions were down toward Jerusalem. And in the course of this, we run into a character who we met briefly earlier in the book of Acts. It's this guy named Agabus. And whether you believe that there's a God who knows the future and could communicate that through a person or not, the text holds out this Agabus guy as being a legitimate prophet who knows stuff about what's going to happen next, presumably through the power of God. So last time around, there was going to be a famine. Agabus correctly predicted that it was coming. And as a result, the churches were all able to gather together and rally behind the affected churches by this nasty famine that did end up occurring. So he's got a good track record. He comes up again here, and he runs into Paul. And it says, coming over to us, this Agabus guy, took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way, the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles." Well, if some nut job says something like this, maybe you blow it off. But if somebody who's been accurate in these kind of nutty predictions says this, maybe you take that a little bit more seriously. Well, apparently this prophecy was compelling to Luke because he says that he and the other people there pleaded with Paul not to go to Jerusalem. But Paul, like Jesus was in the book of Luke, is dead set and resolute about this idea of going to Jerusalem. And he says more or less, if I go there to die, I go there to die, but this is where I need to go. Part one ends with this beware the Ides of March foreboding prophecy moment, but part two takes a different turn. Paul is going to try to avoid the results that Agabus predicted by making an honest attempt to work things out between him and the people who don't like him so much. Here's how it plays out. He comes back into Jerusalem with his traveling companions. He hangs out with James and the elders of the original church, which is a huge deal in and of itself, because just this far back, he was still in the business of trying to kill Christians. Everything has changed. Now Paul is public enemy number one of the hyper-religious Jewish people, and he's the champion of Christianity. Huge things have been accomplished through his work and his missionary trips, and now he's returning not as the enemy of the Christians, but as the conquering hero. But as excited as everybody is to hear his report, they're equally as concerned about Paul's well-being and his fate. So they've got a plan. They tell him, there are people who hate you. They hate what you think. They think you're trying to undermine Moses, da-da-da-da. But here's what you can do. Go and do this whole elaborate ritual purification thing. We got this new thing in Jerusalem. It's not really in the Bible, but the really religious types who are most zealous and worked up, they do all of this extra stuff. They shave their heads. They bathe a certain way. It's all very, very public. If you go to this ridiculous social extreme that you don't need to go to, maybe it will demonstrate to them that you are not their enemy. And Paul's like, yeah, good idea. So he goes and he does that. He shaves his head, which the text almost presents as some kind of sacrifice. But when you really look at someone with an attractive head shape who has their head shaved, you see that it's not so much a sacrifice as it is a gesture of confidence. So just take a minute to just think about that given the current context. A little bit over here. Tina, if you laugh, you ruin the video. So Paul does this thing that is the most radical, unnecessary, far and extreme social move to make. And what he's doing is just saying, I will give you people anything you want. What do you want me to say? What do you want me to be? Whatever it takes, short of denouncing what I most deeply believe, I will give you that to placate you enough to get you to the table so we can work on this thing. That is a very extensive paraphrase, but that's the gist of the gesture. I had a situation. I was hanging out with a friend at an event a couple years ago. And there's a guy who was going to be speaking at this event who came up to us and said, hey, will you guys hang around? Because I'm really excited. I did this thing. It was really controversial. And, I'm going to talk about that and try and make it better. And what he'd done is he'd offended some very radical people. Well, what he didn't know is that some representatives of that very radical group were going to show up at this event. So this guy gets up on stage and kind of explains himself. Here's what I did. Here's what I was thinking. And he falls all over himself to appease this radical group. He insults himself, verbally, self-flagellating himself. I can never remember which one is whipping yourself and which one is farting, but I think it's flagellate. And he's doing whatever he can to make them happy at his own expense. And it gets about 15 minutes into the thing, and representatives of this group stand up and they just start screaming at him. And dude breaks down on stage. He's so broken up over this. And I remember walking out of that just thinking, there are some people where if you make a gesture, they, because they're still alive in their soul, will reciprocate with a gesture. And then conversations happened. And, and in that case, like at worst, you agree to disagree and stuff gets better. But there are other people who have killed that part of their humanity, and they're going to respond to that as weakness and an opportunity to crush you and eliminate one opponent. Well, which one are we going to get here? A response of goodwill or a situation like what I saw at that event? On to part 3. So in part 1, we get this foreboding message. In part 2, we get this honest attempt to try to avoid that outcome. But in part 3, we get to full-on insane zombie time. Paul has bent over backwards to accommodate people to try to get the conversation started. They're not having it. Instead, they see him out walking around. They stir up a mob, and this mob descends on him at the temple. They grab Paul and his companions. They shut the gates of the temple, and while they were trying to kill him, the mob immediately goes to murder. It doesn't matter what you're doing or what you're saying or what kind of kindness or gestures or ovations you're making. We don't want to hear you. We're just going to kill you. You know what's ironic about that? That's exactly what the scene was like when Paul was a part of the other team. Remember? When Stephen was being executed, he was saying some stuff about Jesus, and they plugged their ears and shouted so they wouldn't have to hear it, skipped the whole trial part, dragged Stephen out to the edge of town and hit him with rocks until he shut up because he was dead. Now Paul is on the receiving end of this. Can you imagine what this must have felt like to him? These are his buddies. Think about that. These aren't strangers to Paul. He knows their face. They got yearbook photos together. They did sports together. They did the Jewish club or whatever they lettered in when they were being trained and all of this stuff. They did that together. I'm sure that Paul imagined that if he could just get his friends from the past to sit down, there'd be at least enough history and goodwill that we could reason it out together and at least get to a place where we could peacefully coexist, or maybe you could even hear out my argument for why Jesus might be the fulfillment of everything we studied in school, guys. But instead, he encounters another side of what he remembers about those friends from school, and that's that they have made an agreement together that certain ideas are worth shedding blood over without any thought or any remorse. And now he's on the receiving end of it. So Paul is literally in the process of being murdered by fists by super religious people in front of their most religious sacred site when the Roman commander of the city gets word that his town is in an uproar. So he comes hustling over with a bunch of soldiers and wants to know what's going on. And all the zombies are mobbing Paul and murdering him. And they see what's happening and they back off for just a second. And the commander's like, what is going on? And the zombies murmur one thing and the other zombies murmur another thing, but there's no straight answer. The commander can tell he's dealing with zombie insanity, and so he says, all right, let's just shackle up this beat-up, bloodied dude, and let's take him to the barracks for his own protection. Well, I don't know if the smell of the blood in the air changed things, but all the zombies go back into active mode, and they fight right through Roman soldiers to try to rip apart Paul as he's being escorted across Jerusalem. And with that, we're going to do the cliffhanger thing. We're going to leave it right there with Paul being mobbed by insane zombie bloodthirsty people with limited protection, maybe surviving, maybe not, and we'll pick it up next time around and see what happens. In conclusion, I think the craziest thing about this situation is not that people acted like zombies. We know people can get like that. The craziest thing about this situation is that Paul knowingly walked into it. It says a tremendous amount about not just his character, but of his level of conviction that what he was doing was true and right, even if it was going to be very costly to himself. So the people in Jerusalem tell Paul, as for the Gentile believers, we've written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. And speaking of letters that might contain graphic information about blood or strangled animals or sexual immorality, it's mail time, because I got something in the mail from people in Lexington, South Carolina, and I suspect it's not dangerous, so I'm going to open it now. It looks like it has cards in it. I feel like everybody sent me a card. That really does make it better. Thank you. I'm going to read these later. And there is a shirt. Nice. Hey, thank you very much. I don't usually get shirts in the mail and stuff like this, so I really appreciate it. Everyone from Zion Lutheran Church in Lexington, South Carolina. Totally didn't show you me opening this stuff to be like, oh, wow, maybe I should send him things too, because I watch that show. It's not like that. I mean, if you want to take it that way, it's whatever's fine. It's really fun to get mail, so...